What if the global trade system, the very engine that powered the rise of China, South Korea, and Mexico, is already showing the early fractures of a collapse pattern we have seen unfold in every major economic breakdown of the last century? It is an uncomfortable question, but one that demands attention. Because when a pattern repeats across empires, currencies, and production hubs, ignoring it becomes part of the collapse itself. And today, the signals are no longer subtle. They are structural, they are systemic, and they point to stage 3 of the historical collapse cycle, quietly unfolding inside the global trade network we thought was unshakable. Think about it. Every major trade-dependent economy follows the same trajectory. First comes rapid industrial expansion, then comes dominance in manufacturing, and finally, a saturation point where the world absorbs less than what these nations are capable of producing. The same factories that brought prosperity become pressure and points. The same export strength becomes vulnerability. And the same global supply chain that once ensured stability becomes the first domino to shake when demand softens. That is where China, South Korea, and Mexico now stand. Not at the beginning of decline, but at the midpoint of a predictable historical rhythm. For decades, China powered global consumption. South Korea supplied the technological backbone. Mexico delivered cost-efficient manufacturing to the Western Hemisphere. But today, all three face contracting orders, rising input costs, geopolitical uncertainty, and a world recalibrating its dependence on international trade. These are not temporary disruptions. They are the formation lines of Stage 3, the stage where structural imbalances stop being cyclical noise and start becoming unavoidable reality. And as this shift accelerates, the question is no longer whether the pattern is real, but whether people are willing to see it. Because understanding the early stages of collapse is the difference between reacting late and anticipating what comes next. That urgency is why your perspective matters here. Tell me what you see in your own experience. Have you noticed how global trade feels different today? If this analysis resonates with you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, drop a like to support the channel, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the continuation of this investigation as we dive deeper into the stages that follow, keeping the momentum flowing naturally into what comes next. When we trace the early signs of a collapse pattern inside trade-dependent economies, it becomes clear that the first fractures rarely appear where most analysts expect. They do not emerge in financial markets or currency movements. They begin quietly, deep inside the export engines that once powered national growth. China, South Korea, and Mexico reached global relevance because their manufacturing ecosystems expanded faster than domestic consumption could keep up. This asymmetry created an economic identity built almost entirely on external demand. And historically, this is where Stage 2 transitions into Stage 3, when export-driven nations begin producing more than the world is willing or able to absorb. At first, the shift is almost imperceptible. Orders slow just enough to be excused as temporary cycles. Inventories rise, but executives blame seasonal adjustments. Shipping volumes dip, and officials cite geopolitical noise. Yet beneath these surface explanations, structural imbalances accumulate. Factories do not stop running simply because demand softens. They run because they must. They support millions of jobs, local governments depend on their tax revenue, and national strategies are built around their output. The system becomes locked in motion even as global appetite weakens. This is the hidden mechanism that pulls economies deeper into the collapse sequence without public acknowledgement. Historically, every major export powerhouse eventually reaches this turning point. Japan, in the early 1990s, faced it when its manufacturing dominance exceeded global consumption capacity. Germany experienced it after the 2008 crisis when its industrial strength collided with shrinking European demand. Now, China, South Korea and Mexico are confronting the same silent barrier. Rising productivity no longer equates to rising profits. Global consumers are shifting towards services, digital goods, and localized supply chains. Trade no longer expands linearly. Instead, it contracts in short, sharp waves that expose structural weaknesses more aggressively than ever before. As these pressures accumulate, nations attempt the same set of defensive strategies, subsidizing industries to keep factories open, pushing for new export markets, and relying on domestic credit expansion to mask slowing real demand. But each of these responses only accelerates the disconnect between production capacity and global consumption. The moment a country produces more than the world can realistically absorb, the collapse pattern deepens. And this is where Stage 3 fully takes shape, quietly transforming from a set of scattered warning signs into a structural reality that begins to influence every other layer of the economy. As the collapse sequence advances, the hidden architecture sustaining global trade becomes the central pressure point. Supply chains that once symbolized efficiency and economic integration start revealing their fragility, not through dramatic breakdowns, but through subtle distortions that ripple across industries. China, South Korea, and Mexico are deeply embedded in this architecture, each occupying critical positions that make them both powerful and vulnerable. But vulnerability grows fastest in systems that appear stable on the surface. And today, the global supply chain is showing the same quiet destabilization pattern seen in every historical decline driven by overproduction and shifting demand. Over the last 2 decades, global manufacturing networks expanded faster than any political or economic system could regulate. Components for a single product now cross borders dozens of times before assembly. Factories in one nation depend on raw materials from another, precision components from a third, and final assembly in a fourth. This interconnected web works flawlessly only under conditions of constant demand and geopolitical harmony. The moment either begins to weaken, the chain reacts in ways that expose deeper structural issues. For China, South Korea, and Mexico, this means that fluctuations in global orders transmit almost instantly as production slowdowns, halted shipments, or sudden inventory buildup. The fragility becomes even more visible when companies begin diversifying away from their traditional suppliers. What once ensured growth for these nations is now becoming a source of instability. A shift in strategy by multinational corporations can trigger local factory contractions, disrupt employment cycles, and reduce export revenues long before official statistics acknowledge the trend. The system moves faster than governments can respond. This is how Stage 3 embeds itself, through misalignment between a nation's industrial capacity and a global marketplace that is no longer expanding at the pace those industries were built for. And as these shifts continue, another dynamic begins to unfold. Countries that once competed primarily on cost, scale, and speed now face new demands centered around resilience, proximity, and political alignment. Businesses want supply chains that can survive shocks, not just maximize efficiency. This restructuring changes the flow of trade itself. It reduces the dominance of traditional export leaders and introduces volatility in sectors that previously appeared immune to disruption. For China, South Korea, and Mexico, the challenge is not just adapting to these new expectations, but confronting the reality that their supply chain advantages are slowly eroding as the global system reorganizes. The collapse pattern moves quietly, reshaping the very structures that once guaranteed their success. As the global trade system enters the deeper layers of Stage 3, the warning signs emerging from China, South Korea, and Mexico are no longer abstract economic signals. They are tangible, measurable, and increasingly difficult for policymakers to dismiss. Yet the most revealing aspect of this stage is not the severity of the data, but how quietly the deterioration takes place. Export numbers soften gradually. Factory utilization rates fall by a few percentage points at a time. Shipping indexes drift downward month after month. Nothing seems catastrophic in isolation, but together they form a pattern identical to the early phases of every major trade-driven collapse in modern history. The danger is not in the noise, but in the consistency of the trend. China's export slowdown is no longer limited to a handful of industries. It spans electronics, machinery, and textiles, sectors once protected by global dependence. South Korea, heavily reliant on semiconductors and advanced technology manufacturing, now faces fluctuations that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. These are industries typically resistant to recessionary cycles, yet they are now signaling structural weakness rather than temporary contraction. Mexico, deeply integrated into North American supply chains, is confronting a new kind of vulnerability as companies reassess the sustainability of low-cost outsourcing models. These are not symptoms of an unexpected downturn, they are markers of an economic model approaching its limits. Another hidden signal lies in freight and logistics. Ports that once operated at maximum capacity now show irregular rhythms, with peaks and valleys that no longer correspond to traditional business cycles. Container shortages shift to container surpluses. Transport companies scale operations up and down in rapid succession, reflecting an environment where demand no longer behaves in predictable patterns. These distortions mirror the same early signals that preceded Japan's stagnation in the 1990s and Germany's post-2008 reconfiguration. When trade-dependent giants begin experiencing volatility at the logistical level, it is evidence that the deeper structural gears are grinding out of alignment. Yet the most telling indicator is psychological rather than statistical. Businesses across these nations report uncertainty not about temporary disruptions, but about the long-term viability of the trade model itself. When companies begin preparing for a future where global demand is no longer reliable, it becomes clear that the transition into the next stage of the collapse sequence is already underway. These emerging doubts reflect the broader realization that the world which enabled decades of uninterrupted export expansion is shifting, and that shift is reshaping every assumption built into the modern trade system. As the collapse pattern deepens inside economies built on export strength, one of the most overlooked transformations occurs in the core logic that once sustained their rise. For decades, countries like China, South Korea, and Mexico expanded by leveraging manufacturing capability, cost efficiency, and access to global markets. This model created a predictable cycle: produce more, export more, reinvest earnings, expand capacity, and repeat. But this cycle was only sustainable while global demand could absorb the output. Once demand growth slowed, the very engine of prosperity became a structural burden, forcing these nations to confront a reality that their economic framework was never designed to handle. Manufacturing-based growth thrives on momentum. Factories require continuous production to stay profitable, workers depend on stable schedules, and supply chains function best when orders flow without interruption. But as global consumption shifts away from the traditional goods that powered these economies, a gap emerges between what nations can produce and what the world is willing to buy. This mismatch creates chronic overcapacity, a condition where factories run below optimal levels, yet cannot simply shut down without triggering unemployment, debt defaults, and regional instability. Governments try to compensate with subsidies, tax incentives, or strategic investments, but these interventions often inflate the problem rather than resolve it. In South Korea, the technology sector illustrates this dynamic clearly. Innovations still emerge, but the market can no longer absorb each new wave of production at the scale it once did. Semiconductor supply no longer guarantees steady growth when global cycles fluctuate more violently. In China, entire industrial zones now face cycles of abrupt slowdowns, where inventories expand faster than buyers can be found. Even Mexico, which benefits from geographic advantage and proximity to the United States, experiences strains as production expectations rise faster than North American demand. These pressures reveal a shared pattern. The historical advantage of manufacturing dominance becomes a structural constraint the moment the world shifts toward new consumption models. Another layer emerges when we look at how debt interacts with this slowdown. For years, governments encouraged expansion through credit, assuming the future demand curve would justify the investment. But when that demand fails to materialize, debt accumulates as a reminder that the system is outgrowing its capacity to sustain itself. Companies borrow to upgrade facilities, but returns diminish. Regions invest in infrastructure to support industrial zones, but utilization rates decline. This feedback loop reflects a larger truth. Stage 3 is not defined by crisis, but by the realization that the economic logic of the past no longer aligns with the global reality of the present. In this environment, growth becomes harder to achieve, stability becomes more fragile, and the path forward becomes increasingly dependent on how each nation responds to the widening gap between capacity and global demand. As Stage 3 tightens its grip on global trade, the influence of external shocks becomes far more pronounced. In earlier stages of the cycle, strong export economies can absorb disruptions with relative ease. A temporary slowdown, a geopolitical dispute, or a shift in commodity prices may cause turbulence, but the underlying momentum of demand stabilizes the system. Once a nation enters Stage 3, however, the same disruptions act like accelerants poured onto a structure already strained by overcapacity, declining orders, and diminishing global appetite. What would have been manageable in the past now deepens the cracks in an economic model that has lost its balance. In this phase, shocks do not cause collapse. They reveal it. A sudden decline in global demand exposes the fragility of industries operating on thin margins. A spike in energy prices compresses profitability across sectors built on mass production. Political tensions reshape trade routes, forcing companies to adapt quickly to conditions they never planned for. Each shock interacts with the underlying imbalance between production capability and global consumption, accelerating the decline. For China, periodic lockdowns and geopolitical frictions highlighted just how dependent the world had become on centralized manufacturing and how vulnerable such concentration truly was. For South Korea, fluctuations in technology cycles exposed reliance on industries where the slightest global shift reverberates through every layer of the economy. For Mexico, changes in U.S. policy or supply chain strategies create shocks that ripple instantly through its export base. The most damaging shocks are not necessarily the most dramatic. They are the ones that linger. A prolonged decline in European consumption, for instance, reshapes Asian manufacturing cycles. A sustained recalibration of U.S. import behavior alters production patterns throughout North America. Slow-moving disruptions change business expectations, investment strategies, and hiring decisions. When companies begin planning for volatility instead of growth, it signals that the shock has moved from temporary disturbance to structural influence. In past historical collapses, this shift in business Psychology was a defining feature of the transition from stage 3 into the later, more destabilizing phases. Another dimension of these shocks lies in financial exposure. Export-driven economies often carry debt tied to assumptions of future growth. When external shocks intersect with existing overcapacity, credit markets tighten. Companies delay expansions, banks reassess risk, and governments intervene to stabilize troubled sectors. These interventions are necessary to prevent immediate damage, but they indirectly reinforce the cycle by keeping unproductive capacity alive. This pattern appeared in Japan after the 1990s, resurfaced in Europe after 2008, and now emerges across China, South Korea, and Mexico as they navigate a global environment that no longer supports the uninterrupted expansion their models were built on. In stage 3, shocks no longer act as isolated events. They become catalysts that accelerate every underlying vulnerability, pushing the system toward the next phase of the collapse pattern. As the collapse sequence advances through trade-dependent economies, the social and political consequences begin to surface in ways that are subtle at first, but gain momentum as structural pressures intensify. Stage 3 is not only an economic transition, it is the moment when declining competitiveness starts reshaping the internal dynamics of entire nations. When export orders fall, factories slow, and supply chains contract, the impact travels far beyond industrial zones. It infiltrates household income, local government revenue, labor markets, and ultimately public expectations. This is where the early signs of social strain begin to resemble the same historical patterns observed in nations that eventually entered the more turbulent stages of decline. In China, the effects are most visible in regions built almost entirely around manufacturing clusters. These cities once symbolized economic momentum, attracting millions of workers with the promise of rising wages and upward mobility. Today, many face unpredictable work cycles, declining job security, and rising anxiety about the future. The slowdown in exports does not simply reduce factory output. It disrupts the rhythm of everyday life. Workers accustomed to constant demand confront reduced hours or temporary closures, and local governments dependent on industrial activity struggle to fund social services. These pressures set the stage for subtle yet growing tension between expectations formed in decades of expansion and the new reality of a constrained global market. South Korea faces a different but equally revealing set of pressures. Its prosperity is tied to highly advanced industries where global volatility translates immediately into fluctuations in production and employment. As semiconductor cycles shift and global competitors emerge, workers in key sectors begin to feel the instability that was once confined to lower-value industries. Young professionals, in particular, encounter a labor market where long-term security becomes harder to achieve, creating frustration in a society that built its identity on continuous advancement. These frustrations compound existing demographic challenges, amplifying uncertainty in ways that mirror the early stages of social tension seen in other nations during their transition through the collapse sequence. Mexico's trajectory adds yet another dimension. While its integration with the North American market provides strategic advantages, it also exposes communities to sudden changes as companies relocate production or adjust supply chains. Regions that experienced rapid industrialization begin to confront uneven development, where certain sectors thrive while others stagnate. These disparities create a widening emotional gap between groups who still benefit from the global system and those who increasingly feel abandoned by it. This divide, once established, becomes a breeding ground for political polarization, distrust, and the emergence of competing narratives about who is responsible for the shifting economic landscape. What emerges across all three nations is a shared psychological transformation, a slow erosion of confidence that the old economic model can deliver the stability it once promised. This shift does not explode suddenly. It accumulates quietly, shaping attitudes, altering expectations, and planting the seeds of deeper fragmentation. One of the most defining traits of Stage 3 is the persistence of a powerful illusion, the belief that despite clear structural pressures, a nation can somehow escape the collapse cycle that history has repeated countless times. China, South Korea, and Mexico each carry unique strengths, and these strengths often become the very narratives used to justify the assumption of immunity. China points to its technological ambitions and internal market size. South Korea highlights its innovation-driven industries. Mexico relies on geographic advantage and integration with North American supply chains. Yet history shows that no matter how compelling the narrative, confidence in exceptionalism has never been enough to break the underlying mathematical realities of declining global trade capacity. This belief in escape is not rooted in arrogance alone. It grows from decades of momentum during which these countries built their identities around export-driven success. When an economic model functions for a long period, it forms a psychological anchor, a framework through which leaders, businesses, and citizens interpret every shift. Early warning signs are reframed as temporary disruptions. Structural declines are explained away as cyclical fluctuations. Even as data trends point consistently downward, national narratives emphasize resilience, adaptability, and long-term strategy. This pattern mirrors the early stagnation phases observed in past economic giants, where confidence in prior success overshadowed the growing mismatch between domestic capabilities and global realities. Yet this stage of denial is not merely rhetorical, it actively shapes policy. Governments double down on industrial subsidies, attempting to preserve capacity that no longer aligns with global demand. Companies pursue expansion strategies based on outdated assumptions of infinite market growth. Banks continue extending credit to sectors already strained by overproduction. These actions temporarily sustain the appearance of stability, but they also deepen the very imbalances that make the next stages of collapse unavoidable. By trying to protect the old model, nations inadvertently reinforce the conditions that accelerate its decline. Meanwhile, global dynamics continue shifting in ways that erode the foundations of export-led growth. Economic blocs prioritize self-sufficiency. Geopolitical tensions fragment supply chains. Consumers demand faster, localized production. Technology reduces the need for labor-intensive manufacturing. These forces collectively shrink the space available for traditional export powerhouses, regardless of their history or internal strengths. Even countries with strong governance and high levels of innovation cannot fully counteract a global market undergoing structural contraction. What emerges is a quiet tension between national narratives of resilience and the reality of tightening global constraints. This gap grows wider as Stage 3 progresses, pushing nations toward the point where confidence alone can no longer sustain the illusion of control, and the deeper layers of the collapse sequence begin to take shape. As Stage 3 unfolds across major export-dependent economies, the consequences are not confined to national borders. Global trade is a tightly woven system, and when the central nodes begin to lose momentum, the effects radiate outward through currency markets, financial institutions, and the stability of partner nations. China, South Korea, and Mexico function not only as producers, but as anchors within broader economic ecosystems. Their slowdown marks a shift that reverberates through every country that relies on their goods, their supply chains, or their participation in international commerce. In this way, Stage 3 is not a regional event. It is a global adjustment that exposes the fragility of interconnected systems. Currencies are often the first to reflect this structural tension. As export revenues weaken, nations face pressure on exchange rates, which, in turn, affects their capacity to import crucial resources. A weakening currency can temporarily enhance competitiveness, but when the decline is tied to deeper structural issues, it signals vulnerability rather than opportunity. Investors recognize this distinction quickly. They reallocate capital, tighten risk tolerance, and demand higher returns for lending. This dynamic creates stress for central banks, which must decide whether to defend their currencies, stimulate domestic demand, or preserve financial stability. Each choice carries trade-offs that grow heavier as Stage 3 progresses. For countries heavily integrated with these export powerhouses, the impact is equally profound. Southeast Asian economies that depend on China's manufacturing cycles experience fluctuations in their own production levels. The United States and Canada, deeply tied to Mexico through supply chains and trade agreements, feel shifts in everything from automotive components to agricultural processing. European industries reliant on South Korean technology or intermediate goods face longer lead times and unpredictable costs. These disruptions accumulate, influencing inflation, investment patterns, and long-term strategic planning. The ripple effect becomes a structural challenge, not a temporary inconvenience. Financial institutions face their own pressures as well. Banks exposed to manufacturing debt must reassess the creditworthiness of firms operating in sectors with declining global demand. Investment funds tied to trade-heavy industries adjust their portfolios, amplifying volatility in equity and bond markets. Central banks, observing the tightening conditions, prepare contingency measures that reflect the recognition that the global trade model is shifting. This interconnected response mirrors past eras when declining export capacity in key nations triggered broader global financial recalibrations. What becomes evident is that Stage 3 is not simply about countries losing competitiveness. It is about a global system recalibrating under stress, revealing the extent to which the world relied on continuous growth in trade to maintain balance. As export giants slow, the entire network of currencies, banks, and partner economies adjusts to a new equilibrium, one shaped not by expansion but by contraction. This shift marks the beginning of a broader realignment that sets the tone for the stages that follow. As the dynamics of Stage 3 continue to unfold, the inevitability of Stage 4 becomes increasingly apparent. The structural realignment of global trade exerts pressures that cannot be mitigated by temporary policy fixes or incremental adaptations. China, South Korea, and Mexico, despite their industrial sophistication and strategic advantages, face the undeniable reality that global demand is no longer sufficient to absorb the output they once delivered seamlessly. This transition is not marked by sudden catastrophe, but by a cumulative shift that alters the trajectory of their economies, revealing the next phase of the collapse pattern. The emergence of new trade hubs, regionalization of supply chains, and technological advances that reduce dependency on traditional manufacturing all contribute to this transformation. Companies begin to diversify production geographically, seeking locations closer to end consumers to minimize risk. Governments invest in domestic consumption incentives, but these measures cannot replace the volume and velocity of global trade that once sustained growth. As Stage 3 matures, the gap between potential production and real consumption widens, forcing nations to confront the limits of export-led strategies. Historical patterns indicate that once this threshold is crossed, Stage 4's pressures on currency, labor, and social stability intensify rapidly, setting the stage for the next wave of economic and political adjustments. At this critical juncture, the lesson is clear. No nation, regardless of its past achievements or current strategies, can entirely insulate itself from the forces of global trade realignment. The transition from Stage 3 to Stage 4 is as much about perception as it is about metrics. Policymakers, businesses, and citizens must recognize the structural nature of these shifts and prepare accordingly. Those who ignore the pattern or assume exceptionalism risk being overtaken by forces beyond their control. Understanding the mechanisms of Stage 3 is essential for anticipating the challenges of Stage 4, and this knowledge offers a rare opportunity to act with foresight rather than reaction. If you've followed this analysis so far, reflect on the changes you've observed in trade, production, or economic sentiment in your own region. Share your thoughts in the comments with a phrase like, "This message was for me," if it resonates, so we can gauge the real impact of these shifts collectively. Make sure to subscribe if you want to continue tracking these developments as they unfold, and don't forget to hit like to show support. There's a next video that expands on Stage 4 and the implications for global trade. Click to continue and stay informed, because the sequence we've outlined is moving forward, and understanding it now is critical for what comes next.